In this video, I'm going to show you how to capture professional video for church online. Whether you are doing a true live stream, whether you're pre-recording services and publishing them later, we're going to talk about how to unlock the fundamentals of videography and implementing the best tools for the job. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on how to make your live stream look better. So maybe you're not happy with the way your live stream looks. Maybe it's grainy, maybe it's dark. It just doesn't look very clear or crisp, which can just really have a detrimental effect to the way your viewers are able to engage with your live stream, because it just doesn't look very great to look at. So we're going to help solve some of those problems. We're going to compare, what makes the difference between this type of video quality. All I did is I searched some local churches in my area, searched some live streams, and video quality and production has nothing to say about the quality of content, of the message being preached and things like that. Of course, content is always king. You want to make sure you are preaching great content and delivering great message to your church online. But at the same time, you also want to make sure you have great production quality. I like to have both great content and great quality. And here's an example of a stream that I found locally here in town. I'm based in Colorado, and great church. I know of this church. They're a really great church, but their video quality, it's dark, it's grainy. This is just something, if I were an online church attendee, I wouldn't really want to be looking at this type of footage for very long periods of time. So we'll compare what makes this different from this. This is another church in our area, Red Rocks Church. You probably heard of them. They're a pretty big church with a large reach, especially a large online reach as well. And the quality of this is fantastic. The lighting's great. The coloring's great. It's very crisp. Really great imagery here. So that's what I want to talk about in this presentation. Like, what's the difference here? Like, why does the image on the left look so grainy and dark? It's not very clear. Why does the one on the right look awesome? And of course, the primary goal being, how can we just deliver our message as clearly and professionally as possible? We've got the most important message that we're trying to bring to our congregants online, or maybe people who are just discovering our church for the first time, and we want to make sure that we do that in a quality way with excellence. But Jake, that church on the right here, Red Rocks Church, they have a multi-million-dollar budget. How can I ever achieve that type of professional look? Well, I've got good news for you, and we can debunk some myths around live streaming and video production. You don't need a multi-million-dollar budget to achieve a great look. Like, sure, yeah, Red Rocks has put a lot of resources into their system, but it gets to the point where I actually think you can put just a couple $1,000s into a great videography system for your church online or your live stream and get some fantastic results. And then when you start spending more money than just a few $1,000s, it's kind of like the law of diminishing returns, where it'll improve a bit, but it's maybe going to be a very small increase in improvement when you keep spending tens of thousands of dollars on something. So you don't need a multi-million-dollar or multi-six figure budget, or even some cases you don't even need a multi-five-figure budget. You can really build an amazing system even for less than $5,000. And to prove it to you, here's just a still I took from my church live stream to South Fellowship Church here in Colorado. And we have a pretty modest video production setup. It's not a beginner setup. It's not like Red Rocks, but it's kind of somewhere in between. And I think this works great for a lot of small to mid-sized churches. So I'll talk about kind of the gear and concepts that go into producing something that just looks great for your online audience. So here's what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk about the best video cameras for church live streaming. There's so many options out there, but I'm going to cut to the chase and give you some recommendations. We're going to talk about best practices for lighting design. That's a really key ingredient for having great video quality. We're going to talk about exposure and framing fundamentals. You could have the best camera in the world, but it's not going to look great if you're not using these principles properly. And then finally, we'll talk about the encoding process. And this is something that no one ever thinks about for their church live stream, but you will learn about that in this video. So you might be wondering, who is this dude? My name's Jake Goslin. I'm the creator of a resource called Churchfront and a website called worshipministryschool.com. Churchfront, what we do is we help churches and worship leaders, tech ministry leaders lead gospel-centered and tech-savvy worship. So one of our superpowers is kind of breaking down the complexities of worship ministry, whether that's the technical aspect of it, whether it's the pastoral aspect of it, We really try to simplify it and break it down into practical steps for worship ministry leaders out there. So we usually work more with worship leaders or tech team leaders in churches, but we've also worked alongside of pastors as well. Or sometimes a pastor will reach out to us to consult and train one of the worship ministry leaders at their church. So we visit all the churches out there. You know, if you've heard of a lot of these mega churches, whether it's, you know, Red Rocks or Bethel or Life Church, we've been there. We make fun documentary videos about what all they do to pull this off with their tech systems. And then we kind of like to distill the principles behind these really awesome churches and their like large scale productions. And we try to distill it down into a more practical setup for churches, probably like your church that might be smaller to mid-sized, not on the humongous scale like Life Church is. But even though these churches are huge, you can still learn so much from their setup. So definitely check out our YouTube channel. You'll see we have tutorial videos, videos about the latest tech for churches, videos about worship leading. We do in-depth tech tours of different churches. You can see here they get a ton of views because people really just enjoy learning these types of things, because there's so many great things you can apply, again, from just seeing the technology set up at other churches. You can apply a lot of the same things to your church, even if you don't have a multi-million-dollar budget. And then we have Worship Ministry School. This is our learning platform where we've got online courses, we've got coaching, so students can hop on Zoom calls with us and we can pretty much be there with them in person and just help them build a thriving worship ministry. So here's the big picture of my recommended live streaming setup for churches in 2021. You've got on the left side here, you got our cameras. This is what we're going to be talking more about in this presentation today. Check out my YouTube channel if you kind of want to learn more about all the rest of this. And then we've got the video switcher here, the A10 Mini Pro, which is going to cut your video angles from your cameras here, sends them into the computer, and we like using ProPresenter as streaming software. ProPresenter is a great presentation software. It's a good chance your church already uses it for presentation software. And what's great is with a lot of recent updates, they made it a powerful live streaming software too. So you send your video and your audio into ProPresenter, and then from there, you're going to send your live stream to a multi-streaming platform like Resi or Restream, and then from there, it gets sent to different social media platforms. So before I talk about just mostly the videography aspect of the live streaming setup, I like to kind of back up and just give you some more context of the larger setup that I'm referring to here. And there's more advanced professional setups we've consulted churches with if they want a more hardware-based, robust system. But this is a great way to get set up if you're a smaller to mid-sized church just getting going with live streaming, or just wanting to make some improvements from, you know, using maybe a more cobbled together live streaming system with software like OBS and camcorders and things like that. So this is the big picture. And also, you can go to this URL, worshipministryschool.com/toolkit, to download a link of all of our recommended gear. A lot of it I'm going to mention in this video today, but also within this setup I showed you here. This gives you kind of a gear breakdown for everything that we recommend. So let's talk about the first of the 4 things we want to cover in this video. That is selecting the right video camera. This is such an important step to select the right camera if you want to get better video quality. And a couple of things about the anatomy of a camera. You've got the body of the camera. You've got the camera lens. That's where the light is captured and you can zoom in, you can focus things. The lens directs the light onto the camera sensor. The sensor is a very important aspect of a camera, has a huge impact on the quality of image that you're going to be able to capture, especially in low light situations. The important thing to know is bigger the sensor, generally the better, because it's going to let in more light. Your image will look clearer. You're just going to get a lot better results, probably get better color accuracy as well. So let's cut to the chase. Here's my recommended camera and lens setup for churches who are just getting started with live streaming. You're on a tighter budget and you just want the best bang for your buck when it comes to a live streaming camera. I recommend the Sony a6400 camera body. The reason I do that is I recommend this camera is it has an APS-C sensor that's going to let in more light with less noise and higher image quality. It's going to give you more depth to the image. And then I also recommend the Sony E-mount lens lenses. And what I like about this line of lenses is you can start with some more budget-friendly lenses that cost a couple $100 a piece, to then some higher end lenses that look phenomenal, but they might cost you like a couple $1,000s a piece. It's important to consider sensor types as you're shopping for a camera. I honestly don't necessarily care what specific make or model camera you get. Just make sure the physical hardware of the camera is going to get you good results. And the biggest spec to think about when you're shopping for a camera body is sensor type. So you've got on the left side here the biggest sensors, full frame sensors here in these types of cameras. Then you got APS-C. This is like the sensor on that Sony camera I just recommended. Then you've got 4/3. I would not get cameras with sensors smaller than 4/3. Unfortunately, I see a lot of churches out there getting camcorders, even prosumer camcorders or PTZ cameras that have very small sensors. And if you don't have a ton of light on your stage, which most churches don't, because especially in a modern context, we've got kind of darker lighting design going on, the image is just going to look really grainy. That's one of the main reasons why you saw the results from the comparison that I showed you earlier on. The reason why this image is so much grainier and darker is because they're probably using a camcorder or a cheaper camera that has a tiny little sensor, and it's having to, when the camera is not receiving enough light, it's having to pretty much artificially create light in the body of the camera. And with cheap cameras, it doesn't do a good job at doing that with the ISO or the gain, so it starts distorting it. Whereas this sensor over here for this camera is a much bigger Super 35mm sensor, almost as big as full frame, bigger than APS-C. And that's why you have nice depth to the image. There's no noise in the image. It just looks super clean. The color looks great. And I will say, when you invest into camera gear, when you invest more dollars into lenses, it'll actually significantly boost the quality of your image. That's why I don't think churches really need camera bodies that cost more than $1,000 to $2,000 for a camera body, because you can get the Sony camera I recommended. You can pay a little bit more for a Panasonic GH5 or a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 4K, and then instead of spending $5,000 on just the camera body, then you can spend more money on better lenses. And lenses also have a huge impact on how much light is let into the camera, so how bright it can be, and then also the depth that you get to the image. Like having this camera I'm shooting on right now, it's a higher end camera with a nice lens on it. That's why the background is nice and soft, and then it's focused in sharp on my face, and I'm in a low light environment, but there's no noise. Because it's just I paid more for better lenses with this particular setup. Jake, but what about PTZ cameras, NDI, Sling Studio? You may or may have not heard about any of these solutions out there. They're pretty popular among churches, but I'm personally not a big fan of some of these solutions. Again, it kind of depends on your context. That's why we like coaching people and getting on calls and helping them kind of discern these things. But I'll just say quickly, like PTZ cameras, especially, like they can be great with the PTZ ability, pan tilt zoom ability. I think it's kind of overrated for most churches. The sensors are too small and you just don't get a great video image. NDI, Sling Studio, I don't have much time to go into those right now. They could be worth checking out for your context, but just don't, some of these features and bells and whistles of these different solutions, I just don't think they're great for most churches. Let's talk about the second major thing that's going to have a huge impact on the video quality for church online. That's lighting design. Lighting is so important. You can have the most professional camera in the world, but with poor lighting, you're going to get poor results. So here are my lighting tips. Keep your front lighting or your key light consistent. This is going to be the light that shines on the front of your subjects on stage. Technically, in this environment here, this is my key light. It's just this light we have hanging down from the ceiling over this table. Keep that consistent. Keep it consistent brightness and temperature throughout your stream, because you're going to want to keep your cameras in manual mode, and you don't want to have them in automatic mode adjusting with lighting. It's just going to look terrible as that changes throughout your stream. Don't use colored LED washes as front lights. Use ellipsoidal fixtures or Fresnels that provide a more, either a daylight light or maybe a more tungsten warm light, depending on your white balance or color temperature preferences there. And then use LED washes as back or side lighting to add color. That's kind of what I did here in my studio. You can see I've got these two tube LED lights that are just kind of providing light from the back, and kind of provides like a little bit of a hair light for me, what hair I do have here. And it kind of, it's not turning me blue or yellow, right? Like it's adding color to the image without actually making me look like a Smurf or something like that. So be careful. I've seen this mistake a lot. Churches get LED lights and they're like, ooh, LED lights, let's front light our subjects with it. Then their people look like Smurfs. Don't do that. So you want to have front lighting, good front lighting, sufficient front lighting for your live stream, and then put your LED lights around the back inside of the stage. So those are my lighting tips. If you just do those couple things right, sufficient lighting, and then have some colored lights from around the side and back, it's going to look a lot better. Let's talk about topic number 3 that's really important to get right is exposure and framing. Exposure is how much light your camera is capturing, and these are the controls that you can manipulate within the camera itself to adjust things like aperture, shutter speed, and sensor sensitivity, or ISO. So these are really important to understand, and anybody can learn this. That's the good news. You don't have to be a professional videographer for your whole life to get these things or go to school for it. If you just walk through and understand each of these elements here, then you'll be able to, adjust them with confidence. You'll put your camera in manual mode, and you're going to get the best results for your image. When you put exposure in automatic mode, who knows what your camera's going to do? It could be really grainy, it could be overblown, it could be too dark. That's why you've got to use your eye, you got to use exposure properly. Like I said here, do not use automatic exposure in a church live streaming environment. Use manual mode to set your camera exposure settings during rehearsal. They should rarely need to change since your stage lighting, especially the front lighting on your stage, should remain consistent. So this is the exposure triangle of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Aperture is how large the ring is in your lens that lets in light to hit the sensor. It not only lets in more light, but it actually can add more depth to your image to have that nice blurry background behind your subject. Shutter speed is how fast the shutter is opening and closing on your camera, letting in light to your sensor. The faster the shutter speed, the less light. The slower the shutter speed, the more light is going to pass through. And then ISO, or gain, is the camera's way of artificially boosting light after it's hit the sensor. Shutter speed and aperture are important to get right because you can kind of affect the light before it hits your camera sensor. And then ISO, that's usually the last setting I want to touch if I need to boost the light anymore. But you got to be careful with ISO, because if you boost it too much, it's going to get really grainy. Your image is going to look horrible. And that's, again, looking at that camera comparison we looked at before. It had a small sensor. It wasn't getting enough light, so the camera is like, okay, I'm going to boost the ISO and gain a ton to make this bright enough, and then that's where all the graininess and distortion came through. Framing, that's the other part of actually operating the camera that I see a lot of churches making mistakes here. The framing is the placement and position of the subject within your shot. So in these shots, Craig Rochelle is the subject, and you can see there's 2 different shots, one on the left and one on the right. Let's talk about some of the differences and concepts here. One important one to get right is headroom. You want to have about, the way I like to think of it is if Craig Rochelle were to put his hand above his head right here, the width, the distance between the top of his head and the top of the frame is kind of like what you see here in my shot that I'm framing right now. It's about the height of my hand being on top of my head. So that's one way I like to think about framing and headroom, because you don't want, the image to look like this. Like this would be awkward if I were talking to you with this much headroom the whole time, or if I was like way down here and there's way too much headroom. There's just certain things about framing that look natural and pleasing to the human eye. And going back to these 2 images here, you want to have like maybe a close medium shot, like the image on the left. You can see it's like right above his waist and it has that appropriate amount of headroom. And then he has a wider shot that captures more of the stage, head to toe. And usually wider shots do require a bit more headroom to look pleasing to the eye. So those are a few quick tips with framing that are going to help bring your video production from looking amateur to looking like the person behind the camera does know what they're doing. The final concept I want to talk about when it comes to video quality for your church online or your live stream is encoding. So what is encoding? Encoding is a process of converting a given video input into a digital format that is compatible with most types of web players and mobile devices. So it's making the files smaller for faster, reliable delivery while at the same time retaining quality. There are various ways to encode video. You can have the encoding done within streaming software, or you can get a dedicated hardware encoding device. Generally though, when you get a dedicated hardware encoding device like this Ray encoder by Resi, you're going to get better results because it's allocating more CPU power to basically compress that video down so that it's going to be deliverable to the online audiences, but it's not going to compress it down so much that it's going to look all distorted and grainy, or even it can deteriorate the audio quality if you're not careful enough. You want to have your stream at a high enough, what's called a bit rate, for the quality to be retained as it gets sent to your online audience. So in short, the less computer power you allocate towards encoding, the lower the quality video you'll get. But if you are using a simple streaming setup and you have a computer that's not very powerful, you don't want to encode at too high of a bit rate because then your computer will just kind of run out of processing power. So that's why live streaming computers have to be beefier, have some better specs there to produce better results. So again, back to the big picture here. I know I covered a ton. We talked mostly about setting up the cameras for success and having proper lighting for your setup. We also talked about encoding, which usually happens around this part of the process right here. There are so many other aspects to a church live stream. We didn't even talk about audio today, but actually in the last Church Online Summit talk that I gave the whole presentation dedicated just to live stream audio, tips for mixing your band better, and just having a great broadcast audio setup. So check out that video at a later time if you want to learn more about the audio side of things. But video is also really, really important, and just get the right tools and also learn how to use those tools, because I see so many churches dropping so much money on cameras right now, but nobody's taking the time to actually learn how to use the cameras properly. And as much as I love our smartphones and our iPhones, using more professional cameras isn't like an iPhone that does all the magic inside for you. You just point and shoot. You have to actually take the time to learn how to dial in the settings for exposure and frame your shot. I want to remind you to check out the Worship Ministry Toolkit for a ton of URLs to our recommended gear that you can get for your church live streaming setup. And again, here are the 4 steps just to recap what we covered today. We talked about the best video camera for church live streaming, best practices for lighting design. We talked about exposure and framing fundamentals. And then finally, we talked about encoding. So thanks so much for taking the time to watch and listen to this presentation. I hope you have a few tips you can take away to improve the video quality for your church online experience. For many more videos that dive deep into these various topics and those fun worship tech tour videos that we make, go to youtube.com and just search Churchfront or Jake Goslin. My videos will pop up there, and you can kind of go down the YouTube rabbit hole there. If you'd like to work with my team, go to worshipministryschool.com, where you can apply to join our training and consulting program. Keep up the great work in your ministry, and I'll see you next time.